Hey guys, tonight we begin with the inside of a Mongol war camp, a world of felt walls, frozen mornings, and a military machine so efficient it made the rest of the medieval world feel like it was still working out the fundamentals of organised movement. Then we move to Genghis Khan himself, a man who started with nothing in the literal sense of that word, who built the largest contiguous empire in human history from the specific wreckage of his childhood, and who left behind a legacy that historians still cannot quite agree on how to characterise without immediately qualifying everything they say. After that, we spend some time being a Mongol archer, which sounds exciting until you realise how much of the job involves pain, repetition, weather that has developed strong opinions about you, and a horse that has absolutely no interest in your emotional needs. And finally, we look at the hidden reality of the Mongol court, the world behind the campaigns, where politics and poison, and a surprising number of women holding genuine authority, shaped an empire that everyone feared, but almost no one fully understood from the inside. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in the dark not because you plan to, and not because anything as gentle as an alarm is involved. You wake up because the cold has found you. Not the polite, brisk cold of an autumn morning that makes you pull the covers up and drift pleasantly back towards sleep with something approaching contentment. This is a different kind of cold entirely. This is the cold that has been working on you methodically for several hours, quietly, persistently, without any interest in your preferences or your comfort or your opinion on the matter. It has crept in through the felt walls of the Jier, settled itself into the ground beneath you, and arranged itself around your body in a way that makes it thoroughly clear that your well-being was never part of any calculation that led to this situation. You lie still for a moment, trying to convince yourself that you imagined it. You did not. The fire in the centre of the Gur has burned down to almost nothing, a few orange coals doing their very best but clearly and comprehensively outmatched by the volume of coal they are being asked to address. The smoke hole at the very top of the Gur is a dark grey circle against a sky that has not yet decided whether it wants to be black or the pale, cold blue that comes just before dawn when the dark begins to lose its confidence. Either way, it is not sunlight. Sunlight is very far away, and it is not your schedule that determines when you will be permitted to experience it again. You're a soldier in the army of Genghis Khan. You're possibly 12 years into this existence, possibly more. The years on campaign blur together in ways that civilian time never does, because civilian time has landmarks to orient by, seasons measured by planting and harvest, by festivals and the familiar rhythms of a fixed home. Your time is measured by distance and by the names of places crossed and by the specific quality of different categories of exhaustion, which become as distinguishable to you as the names of colours. What you know with certainty is that you are cold, that the blanket covering you is insufficient for the work it has been assigned, and that somewhere outside this Gur there are horses that need your attention before the camp properly begins its morning. You sit up slowly. Your body reports several concerns in rapid succession, in the manner of a thorough clerk presenting overdue complaints that have accumulated during the night. Your shoulders are stiff in a way that feels structural rather than temporary, the kind of stiffness that suggests the muscles have been locked in defensive posture against the cold for hours and have not received notice that the situation is changing. Your hands are slow to close, the knuckles aching with a persistence that speaks of duration rather than injury. Something in your lower back has a formal and specific objection that it would like to register with whatever authority is theoretically responsible for these conditions, and it would like to register it repeatedly. You note all of the objections, file them under things that will not improve by being given extended attention, and stand up anyway, because there is no authority here that will address these complaints, and standing up is simply what comes next. The Gur itself is, when you think about it, a remarkable piece of engineering, though you do not think about it in those terms, because you have never known any other kind of home, and remarkable is not a category that applies comfortably to things that have always simply been there. It is a circular lattice of bent willow wood covered in layers of pressed felt, assembled and disassembled by experienced hands in under an hour by people who have been doing it since early childhood. which is the only acceptable pace given the demands regularly placed on it. It is warm enough when the fire is properly maintained, which it currently is not, because the fire has made its own calculations about the available fuel and has arrived at conclusions that do not favour you. The floor is covered in woven rugs and animal skins laid over the bare earth, layered in the particular way that experience teaches is most effective, and it is still cold beneath your feet when you stand. The walls breathe slightly against the wind outside, a barely perceptible flex inward and outward, like the slow breathing of something large and patient. Cooking pots hang from the central tonneau frame above the fire pit. A saddle rests near the door on its designated stand, because a saddle left on the floor is a saddle that will be stepped on and damaged, and things in this camp that are damaged through carelessness tend to fail at moments when failing is most expensive. Everything is precisely where it needs to be, because in this world, things that do not have a proper place do not survive long enough to accumulate history. The design of the gear is the product of centuries of refinement for this exact situation, and knowing that it has been refined does not make it any less impressive to consider what the refinement achieved. The lattice walls, the khana, can be expanded or contracted to adjust the interior diameter, making the structure adaptable to different group sizes and different weather conditions. The felt covering can be rolled up at the base during warm weather to allow ventilation, and lowered in winter to provide insulation. The smoke hole at the top, the tonneau, can be covered or uncovered to manage the airflow through the fire, and the temperature of the interior, and the cover for it, the urch, is managed from inside by a rope that allows adjustments without exposing anyone to the outside cold. The door faces south, always south, both for the practical reason that the dominant winds from the north are blocked by the structure itself, and for the cultural reason that south is associated with good fortune, with the light, with the open direction. The orientation of every gear in the camp is the same. This is not coincidence, and it is not decoration. It is the result of a long time working out what works. Inside the gear, space is organised along clear lines that everyone who uses these structures understands. The northern side, directly opposite the door, is the honoured position, where guests of significance sit and where the household's most valued items are kept. The western side is where the men's equipment lives, the saddles and the weapons and the tools. The eastern side is where the women's domain is organised, the cooking equipment and the household supplies. The fire at the centre is the axis around which everything else is arranged, literally and in some ways metaphysically, because the fire is the heart of the household, and its maintenance is understood as a responsibility that extends beyond keeping warm. You move through this space in the ways that are correct for a person of your status and role, not because you are thinking about it, but because you learned these patterns early enough that they are simply how the space works. You pull on your dell, the long-quilted robe that functions as the fundamental unit of thermal management in this climate, and that is also, in its construction and its wearing, a cultural statement about who you are and where you come from, though you do not think of it in those terms either. You wrap it across your body, left side over right, the way it is always worn, the way everyone here wears it, the same orientation that has been maintained across generations for longer than any living person can trace it back. Then the belt, firm and wide, because a Mongol soldier without a belt is a man who has not yet finished getting dressed, and getting dressed in this context is a complete act with no optional components, because the optional components are the ones that fail you at the moment you most need them not to. The layers of clothing that a soldier in this army wears are not a fashion statement. They are a carefully developed engineering response to the problem of keeping a human body functional, in conditions that would otherwise bring it to a stop with considerable efficiency. The inner layer of soft wool against the skin, wicking the moisture that the body produces in the effort of staying warm. The dell over that, quilted and substantial. The outer robe for when the cold is having a particularly determined day. The boots, which are as much equipment as clothing, felt lined and designed around the specific demands of a life that spends more time in the saddle than out of it. Shaped at the toe to fit correctly in the stirrup, thick at the sole against the cold that comes up from frozen ground. Outside the Jur, the camp is already beginning to come to life. It always surprises you slightly, this early movement, even after all these years of it, because there is a quality to the pre-dawn camp that the full daylight hours do not replicate. It is quieter than the day, but purposeful in a way that is somehow more present than the noise of midday, as if the reduced sensory input makes each individual piece of activity more distinct and more visible. Figures move between the Jurs in the grey half-light. their breath visible in the cold air in small white clouds that appear and disappear, their movements economical and deliberate in the way of people who have long ago stopped wasting effort on motion that does not have a purpose. The low sounds of the horses at their tethering lines, the soft percussion of hooves shifting on frozen earth, the occasional sound of an animal making its opinion of the cold known. Somewhere nearby, the particular metallic sound of a cooking pot being positioned over a fire that someone had the discipline and the responsibility to keep fed through the watches of the night. And the smell of the camp at this hour, which is complex and layered in ways that are difficult to separate into individual components. Smoke and animals and boiled food from the previous night, and the wet felt of the jeers and the particular smell of earth that has been lived on for several days in the same spot, and has begun to absorb the accumulated record of that habitation. The camp is not a casual arrangement. That is the first and most important thing that an outsider would misunderstand if they were somehow standing here at this hour, which they would not be, because outsiders in the vicinity of this camp tend to have very short and very unhelpful experiences before the question of their observations becomes moot. What looks from a distance like the chaotic sprawl of a nomadic settlement is, on examination, organised with a precision that reflects the fundamental character of this operation, which is that everything is where it needs to be for the purposes it will be called upon to serve. Everything moves when and exactly when it needs to move, and nothing exists here for decoration or sentiment. The jers are arranged in the roughly circular pattern that allows for efficient communication between units in any direction, for rapid response to alerts arriving from any point of the compass, and for the kind of mutual visibility between different sections of the camp that makes individual confusion or unauthorized absence more difficult. The horse lines are positioned so that the animals can be reached quickly in the dark without the delay of navigating through other equipment or structures, because the situation that requires a horse to be reached quickly in the dark is not a situation that benefits from delay. The wagons are placed at the edge of the camp in configurations developed over years of experience to allow them to serve as a defensive barrier if the situation requires it, and to be loaded and moving in the shortest achievable time if an order to relocate comes without prior announcement. Even the fires are managed collectively, because warmth out here is not a personal luxury that belongs to whoever can afford it. It is a tactical resource, distributed according to need and priority, maintained as carefully as any other supply. You make your way to the horse lines in the near dark, which is the first task of every morning, and has been the first task of every morning for as long as you can clearly remember, because horses do not understand that you are cold and not yet fully awake, and would prefer to have your morning tea before addressing the needs of another living creature. Your horse is a Mongol horse, which means it is compact and shaggy, and built for endurance over terrain that would destroy an animal bred for appearance, and it is possessed of an attitude that suggests it regards your needs as one of several factors. It is prepared to weigh, but does not feel bound by any agreement to prioritize. It looks at you as you approach with an expression that manages to communicate both alert awareness of your presence and profound indifference to your emotional state this morning. You check its legs, running your hands down each one in the exact sequence you have performed thousands of times, feeling with your palms and fingers for heat that should not be there, for swelling that was not present yesterday, for any change from the baseline that you know so thoroughly it might as well be the map of your own body. Then the hooves, lifting each one in turn, examining the condition of the horn and the structures within, because a horse with a problem developing in its feet will show you the problem in the feet before it shows you the problem anywhere else. And catching it early is the difference between a manageable situation and a crisis. Then the coat, the eyes, the general quality of the animal's demeanour, because a horse that is developing an illness often shows changes in its attitude before it shows changes in its physical condition, and you have known these animals long enough to read the difference. This attention is not affection, though it is not the absence of it either. It is maintenance. You care about the horse the way you care about your bow and your water container and your boots, with the specific and practical attentiveness of a person who understands that the reliability of these things is directly and immediately connected to whether they continue to exist. A horse that breaks down on campaign is not merely an inconvenience. It is a cascade of operational problems that begins the moment the animal stops performing and compounds rapidly as the situation that required the horse's performance continues to make its demands. You do not allow things to break down when attention during the ordinary hours could prevent it. You feed the horse from the supply that was allocated the previous evening, which is sufficient and no more than sufficient, because every resource in this army is calculated to the minimum required for function, and nothing is set aside for surplus that the campaign cannot afford to carry. The supply system that keeps this operation moving across distances that most settled armies would find logistically paralysing is one of the genuine organisational achievements of the Mongol military, a system that draws on the resources of territories the army passes through, that has established stores at calculated positions along the expected routes, that accounts for the needs of men and animals across weeks of sustained movement without the supply line collapsing under its own weight. You do not think about it in those terms because you do not need to. You know that the food arrives because it always arrives, that the horses are fed because they are always fed, and that the people responsible for ensuring this are doing so with the kind of consistent efficiency that in this organisation is understood to be the only acceptable standard. Breakfast is communal and quick, as it has been every morning of every campaign you have been part of. Someone has already heated the sute tsai, the tea made with salt and fat and milk that is the morning anchor of this culture, and that is warming in a way that no lighter, more pleasant beverage could manage in this cold. You drink it from the wooden bowl you carry as a matter of personal equipment, the same bowl every morning, because in this army you carry what you own, and you own only what you can carry without it affecting your speed or your function. The bowl has been with you long enough that holding it is a kind of comfort in itself, the wood smooth and darkened from use, a familiar weight. The tea is not delicious in any sense that a person of comfortable habits would recognise. That is not the category it belongs to. It enters your body and performs the specific function of telling your body that the day has begun and that the day will require things of it, that warmth is available if you move, that the night has ended and the morning is here, and the morning will proceed whether you are ready or not. There is dried meat alongside it, pressed and dense in the way that makes it resistant to spoilage across the distances it must travel, and it requires your back teeth to engage with it as a serious undertaking before it becomes anything resembling food. There is dried curd, hard as compressed stone, that must be held in the mouth and worked with patience before it dissolves into something that can be swallowed. You eat what is provided with the efficiency of someone who has long since ceased expecting meals to be an experience and has accepted them as a daily transaction in the ongoing negotiation of survival. Calories in, function out. That is the agreement the campaign requires of you, and that you have made with it. The conversation around the fire at this hour is brief and quiet in the way of people who have known each other long enough that words are used only when they are doing work. The men next to you have been in your Arban for years, some of them for the majority of the time you have served. You have shared enough cold mornings and difficult days and dangerous hours that communication between you has become largely efficient, stripped of the social scaffolding that strangers use to negotiate interaction. Someone makes a dry observation about the temperature. The temperature is the same as yesterday, which was the same as the day before. The observation is social rather than informative. It acknowledges the shared reality without asking anyone to perform feelings about it that would be exhausting and pointless. Someone else responds with something equally economical. There is a brief sound that functions as laughter in the register of people for whom laughter is something to be conserved for conditions that actually earn it. Then silence. This is how communication works here. Brief, precise, with a high ratio of content to words, because everything that does not need to be said should not be said, and most things do not need to be said to people who have been watching you, do the same things day after day for years and already know what you think. The orders for the day come down through the decimal structure that makes this army function, the organisational system that Genghis Khan imposed on the military in the early years of his rise, and that has remained the underlying architecture ever since, dividing everything into units of 10, 100, 1,000 and 10,000, each with a designated commander, each commander accountable upward to the next level, each soldier accountable to the level immediately above. The logic of this structure is not complicated. It means that every person in the organisation knows exactly who their commander is and has a face to put to the authority they answer to, which reduces the confusion and delay that plague armies organised around less direct chains of responsibility. You are in a unit of 10. The 9 men in your Arban are the people your survival most directly depends on and whose survival most directly depends on you, which is a more intimate form of mutual reliance than most social structures produce. You know their capabilities the way a skilled craftsperson knows the qualities of the tools they work with daily. not because you made a study of it, but because the knowledge accumulated through years of proximity and necessity, through watching what they do under pressure and what they do when the pressure eases, through the small, continuous information of daily life shared in close quarters over a long time. The system has a quality that outsiders find difficult to understand, which is that it does not depend on the enthusiasm or the goodwill of the people within it to function. It depends on the clarity of its structure and the enforcement of its expectations. A soldier who performs poorly in this army has a very specific and visible accountability. The commander of the Arban is accountable for the performance of the 10. The commander of the 100 is accountable for the performance of the 10 Arbans beneath them. This chain of accountability means that poor performance does not disappear into the general noise of a large organisation. It surfaces immediately at the level where it occurred and is addressed at that level. The people at the bottom of the structure know this, and the knowledge shapes behaviour in ways that no amount of inspirational leadership would achieve without it. The system does not assume virtue. It structures incentives, and the incentives work. The commander of your Arban delivers the day's orders with the economy of someone who has said these kinds of things many times and has no interest in adding ornament. His face is the product of decades in this environment, broad and weathered in the specific way of the steppe, which produces a particular kind of skin, neither old nor young exactly, but thoroughly conditioned. The orders are clear. Today is a march day. Not an engagement, not a siege operation, not the kind of day that will later be assigned a specific name in someone's account of this campaign. Just a march day, which is, in its own particular way, harder than a battle day, because a battle day is at least briefly, terribly, completely present, while a march day is just distance, accumulated incrementally across hours that do not distinguish themselves from each other, in weather that has settled into its opinion and has no intention of revising it, until you either arrive somewhere or receive an order that changes the direction. You break down your portion of the gyr in the sequence that has been done so many times it requires no conscious management. The felt panels come off in the order they were put on, because that is the order in which they fold correctly for loading. The lattice walls, the khana, collapse inward and bundle with a compactness that their expanded size makes seem implausible. The central tuno and its supporting poles come apart and stack. The doorframe folds. Everything loads onto the wagons or the pack animals in the arrangement that has been determined over years of experience and is now simply the correct way, not subject to revision or individual preference. You've done this more times than you can count with any precision, and your hands know the sequence without consulting the mind, which is free to attend to other things while the hands do their work. The camp dismantles with the efficiency that characterises everything this organisation does well. What was 40 minutes ago a functioning settlement, with fires burning and food heating, and people in various states of morning activity, is now a series of loaded wagons and mounted riders preparing to move. The great supply wagons, some of them substantial, loaded with provisions and equipment, and the larger personal effects of the senior commanders, whose households travel with the army, begin to roll with the sound of wheels on frozen ground. The horse lines dissolve into individual riders who take their positions without being explicitly directed to do so, because everyone knows where they belong in the formation. The fires are extinguished with care because a fire left burning on the steppe can become a problem that follows you at a distance, and problems created by carelessness are not considered acceptable. And then the whole operation moves this population of soldiers and support personnel and horses and equipment and wagons, and it moves together in the direction that has been established, at the pace that has been set, without the uncertainty and delay that seem to accompany every departure of every other army you have ever heard described. To anyone watching from outside the column, the speed of this assembly and disassembly would register as remarkable. A settlement housing hundreds of people, with sleeping areas and cooking fires and equipment and animals, reduced to a moving column in the time it takes other armies to organise breakfast for their vanguard, and then, at the day's end, reconstituted from nothing in the time it takes those same armies to find their camping ground. This is not a performance. There is no audience and no occasion for reflection on it. It is simply what is done at the beginning and end of each day, as automatic as the checking of the horse and the management of the water supply. But the speed is real, and the effect of it on anyone trying to respond to this army's movement is also real, because a force that can appear and disappear faster than a response can be organised is a force that carries its unpredictability as a weapon. The sound of the army at full movement is a sound that settles into the memory and stays there. Not the sound of individual components, though those are present too, but the collective sound of the whole, which is something different from the sum of its parts. The low continuous rumble of the wagon wheels over the frozen ground, which carries through the earth as much as through the air. The collective sound of the horses, which at this scale is less like individual hoofbeats, and more like weather, like a persistent and directional percussion that moves with the army and changes in character as the terrain changes beneath it. The wind. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The wind finding its way through the mass of people and equipment and making its own contribution, which is different depending on whether the air is passing through wool or felt or leather or the gaps between them. And underneath all of that, present but rarely distinct, the sounds of the people themselves, brief voices, the particular creak of a loaded saddle at a certain pace, the sound a quiver makes when it settles against the saddle at a particular angle, the clip of harness hardware. These individual sounds are lost in the larger sound most of the time, but they are there, the texture of the surface of the larger thing. You ride into the early light with your horse moving beneath you in the smooth, economical, ground-covering gait that the Mongol breeds maintain across distances that would exhaust animals built to a different standard. Your unit rides in the formation that is theirs, around which the larger formation of the 100 organises, around which the larger formation of the 1,000, and so on outward until you arrive at the full spread of the army on the move, which from any position inside it is impossible to fully see, visible only as the portions immediately adjacent to you and implied by the sounds and the patterns of movement that extend beyond your sight. Far ahead, already invisible, the scouts. The army does not approach terrain without knowing what the terrain contains, and the scouts are the mechanism by which that knowledge is acquired. They are out there now, reading the ground hours ahead of your position, relaying information back through the system that ensures it arrives where it needs to be before it ceases to be useful. The march carries you across ground that changes slowly enough that the changes are felt before they are seen. The quality of what is beneath the horse's hooves, the slight variations in the firmness of the frozen earth, the patches where the frost has gone deeper and the surface is harder, the places where a buried watercourse has kept the ground softer despite the cold, the direction of the wind and its temperature, which shifts across the day in patterns that the steppe has its own logic for, rising and falling with the temperature differential between the land and whatever lies beyond the horizon, the way the light sits differently on the ground at different hours, flat and cold in the morning, harder and more direct when the sun reaches its highest point in the pale winter sky, going long and amber and horizontal in the late afternoon as the day considers concluding. The landscape itself is one of the most important facts of this existence, and one of the most difficult to explain to someone who has not lived within it. People from forested or mountainous places tend to find the steppe disorienting. The absence of vertical landmarks, the way the horizon seems to recede at the same rate you advance toward it, producing the persistent impression of no progress despite sustained movement. For you, it is simply the world. The steppe is not featureless. It is legible in ways specific to people who have learned its language. The quality of the grasses indicates what lies beneath them in terms of soil and water. The behaviour of the wind across different terrain configurations tells you about what lies in the directions you cannot yet see. The specific colours of the sky at the horizon indicate the weather of the next several hours, with a reliability that organised observation has refined into something close to method. The tracks and signs of animals tell you what else moves through this landscape, from which direction, how recently. All of this is information, continuously present, continuously relevant, read by your eyes without a decision being made about it. You have been reading this landscape since you were old enough to be taken across it, and you read it now the way you breathe, without choosing to. The Mongol army on the march is reading this landscape collectively, not as an organised exercise, but as the aggregate output of thousands of individuals each attending to their own portion of it. The scouts read it most deliberately and communicate what they find through the relay system that keeps information moving. But every experienced rider is also running a version of the same assessment, passively noting the conditions, registering deviations from the expected pattern, contributing to the distributed situational awareness that makes this army very difficult to surprise in its native environment. Armies that can be surprised in open country have not attended to the ground correctly. This army has been doing nothing but attend to the ground correctly for the entirety of its existence. Hours pass with the particular patience of hours that have nothing to recommend them except continuation. The body's complaints, which were various and specific at the start of the day, become first familiar, then part of the background texture of the experience, then simply the condition in which the day is occurring, neither better nor worse than expected, simply present. The cold of the early morning eases as the body generates heat through sustained movement, the muscles doing their continuous work and producing warmth as a necessary byproduct of doing that work. Your hands loosen on the reins, your shoulders drop fractionally from the elevated, defended position they hold when the cold first gets into them. The horse finds its rhythm and you settle into it with the ease of long familiarity, and there is in this sustained movement a quality that is not comfort exactly, because comfort requires the absence of demand, but is something in the neighbourhood of functional equilibrium, a state in which you are doing what you are built to do at the pace that your resources can sustain, and the system is working as it is supposed to work. You eat from the bag at your side without stopping, because stopping to eat is not the way this is done and has never been the way this is done. A handful of dried meat, worked between the back teeth while the horse maintains its gait, a piece of dried curd held in the mouth and dissolved slowly into something that can eventually be swallowed. Somewhere in the supply arrangements there will be a proper meal at the end of the day, something cooked, something hot, something that functions as the boundary between one day and the next. Until then, this is sufficient, and sufficient is the category that governs most of what happens out here. Water is managed with more care than food. You drink from the skin at your side on a schedule rather than in response to thirst, because by the time you're genuinely thirsty, the calculation has already shifted against you, and the Mongolian steppe in winter does not always offer the opportunity to correct the calculation at the time that you would prefer to correct it. The supply of water is finite, and the campaign's next reliable source is a variable that is tracked but not always certain. You take what you need, no more, and you do not let thirst make the decision for you. There is, in the rhythm of a long march day, a quality of mind that develops after enough hours of sustained movement. Not sleep, not emptiness, but a kind of productive quiet. The mind settles into its monitoring functions, tracking the terrain and the formation and the weather and the behaviour of the horse, maintaining the peripheral awareness that this kind of movement requires, and releases the rest, the forward planning and the background assessments and the private narrations of experience that fill the mind when the mind is not occupied. What remains is present and attentive without being active, like a system running at the maintenance level, doing what needs to be done and conserving everything else for when it is needed. Years of march days produce this state automatically. You do not achieve it, you simply arrive in it. The middle hours of the day bring their own specific challenge on campaigns that take the army into warmer territories than the frozen morning suggested. The cold that required all of your layered clothing at dawn may have become, by midday, an active liability, the same layers that protected you from the cold now trapping the heat that your body generates in sustained movement and the heat that the sun delivers from above. Managing this transition is part of the daily operational skill of this life, and it is managed through the adjustment of clothing, the opening of layers, the timing of water consumption relative to the body's heat load, and the reading of the horse, whose behaviour under heat stress gives you information about your own threshold before your own body provides it directly. The horse's breathing changes. Its pace suggests more effort for the same output. These are signals. You read them the way you read the ground. The hierarchy of the camp is visible in everything, including the midday management. The senior commanders have horses that carry personal water supplies large enough to allow more liberal drinking. They have attendants who can take the horse during brief halts while they rest. Their equipment is managed by other people, which frees their attention for the command decisions that are their specific responsibility. You do not have these things. You manage your own horse, your own water, your own equipment, your own attention, and your own body, across the full length of the march day, because that is what your position in the structure requires. The hierarchy is not oppressive, it is functional. The people at the top of it need to be thinking about different things, and the arrangements support that requirement by removing the ordinary maintenance demands from them and distributing those demands appropriately among the people whose job it is to handle them. You are one of the people whose job it is to handle them. You handle them. When something interrupts the quiet, you notice it before you have processed what it is. A change in the pace of the column. A scout returning faster than the pace of normal communication. A shift in the behaviour of the commanders visible some distance ahead. A grouping that was not there before. A change in the angle of heads and bodies. These things register as anomalies before the mind has decided what they mean, because the body has learned to notice the pattern of normal and report deviations immediately, ahead of understanding. You watch. You maintain your formation. You wait for the information to reach your level through the structure that delivers it. Today the change passes without escalation. The column adjusts slightly, the direction modifying by some degrees to account for something the scouts found that required going around rather than through, and then settles back into its established pace. The rest of the day unfolds in the rhythm established before dawn. The sun crosses the sky with the slow arc it maintains at this latitude in this season, never warm enough to matter, but present enough to give the day its structure and its light. The shadows rotate slowly. The steppe continues in every direction, flat and pale and vast, in the way of things that have been here for a very long time, and will be here for a very long time after you're gone and do not require your attention or your presence to continue being exactly what they are. The halt comes in the late afternoon, when the light has gone long and horizontal and the shadows of the horses reach far out to the east. The place has been chosen for reasons, as it always is. Proximity to a frozen stream that the horses can drink from if the ice is broken at the correct place, which the people whose job it is to know such things already know. Ground that faces partially away from the dominant wind direction, which is not shelter exactly, but is less wind than the alternative. Enough space for the camp to be laid out in the correct arrangement without crowding. You do not assess these things yourself. Someone above you in the structure assessed them, based on information gathered by the people above them in the structure, and the assessment has been correct consistently enough that trust in it is the reasonable position. The camp goes up in reverse of the morning, the lattice expands, the felt goes on, the tonneau is lifted, the fire is made, the cooking pot goes on the fire, the horses are cared for, this time with the more thorough attention that the end of a march requires, because the day's work has costs that must be assessed and addressed before the night, because the night is when the animals rest and the rest only does its work if what was wrong has been identified and managed. You go through the check again, the legs, the hooves, the coat, the eyes, the demeanour, the same check you did this morning, looking for what the day added to what was there at the start of it. There is a moment during the camp setup, brief and unrepeatable, when the ger has just been assembled and the fire has just been lit and the felt walls have just begun to hold the warmth, and the transition from the cold, open exposure of the march to the enclosed warmth of the interior happens all at once. You step in from the outside, where the wind has been your constant companion all day, and the sky has been your only ceiling, and you step into a space that is bounded and warm and yours for the night. The scale of the contrast from the enormous to the intimate, from the exposed to the sheltered, from the cold to the warm, produces something that is not quite relief and not quite gratitude, and is perhaps the specific feeling of having earned something. The ger is the same ger it has always been. The fire is the same fire it is every night. But this particular moment of transition, repeated hundreds of times across years of campaign, does not seem to lose its quality. It is always this, the specific comfort of an enclosed space after a day of open exposure. Some things, it turns out, do not become merely ordinary regardless of how often they are repeated. They remain themselves. The food that appears when the cooking is done is what it always is. Boiled meat, the broth it produced, dried elements added to the pot to extend and thicken. It is not an ambitious meal. It is a meal whose ambition is to be sufficient, and it is sufficient. You eat it with the appetite of genuine hunger, which is the purest form of appetite, uncomplicated by preference or standard, or the memory of alternatives. When the body has spent the day doing what it was built for, what it wants in the evening is exactly what it is given, and the match between need and provision produces a satisfaction that has nothing to do with the quality of the food and everything to do with the accuracy of the transaction. The fire changes the quality of the ger when it is properly going. What was cold and grey becomes warm and amber, the shadows in the felt moving slightly with the movement of the flame, the interior of the small space filling with the smell of burning wood and cooking food, and the particular smell of felt that has been warmed, which is a smell that belongs to this specific category of existence and to nothing else. The food is not elaborate, it never is, but it is hot, and hot is a category that at the end of a march day earns its consideration. You sit with your bowl and eat with the specific appetite of a body that has spent the day doing what it was built to do, and has now been given what it needs to continue doing it tomorrow. The conversation around the fire at this hour is slightly longer than the conversation at breakfast, because the end of the day has produced something worth the few words required to acknowledge it. The terrain had a particular quality in the afternoon that deserves a comment. Someone's horse had a period in the middle of the day when its behaviour was interesting enough to note. The scouts returned with something that created the brief change in course. None of these things require extended discussion. They are noted, briefly characterised, acknowledged as shared experience and set aside. This is the daily maintenance of the social fabric that holds a unit together across years of difficult work. The small continuing acknowledgements that the day happened to all of you, that you're still here at the end of it, and that tomorrow will also happen to all of you. You fall asleep before the decision is fully made. Your body makes it first, the transition from the half-drowse by the fire to the deeper absence of sleep happening gradually in the way of genuine exhaustion, the sounds of the camp softening, the cold becoming abstract, the awareness of the other bodies in the gyre becoming a generalised warmth rather than individual presences. And then the sleep, complete and total, the kind that a body that has done what was required of it falls into without reservation, without the half-wakefulness of people whose days did not cost them anything. Outside the gyre in the darkness of the steppe, the camp continues its night operations. The watches change at their designated intervals. The horses are checked. The perimeter is maintained by the people whose rotation of responsibility it is to maintain it tonight. The system that allows this many people to sleep safely in the middle of a landscape that has no inherent sympathy for their survival operates through the small hours, managed by those whose job it is, which is not your job tonight. Tonight your job is to sleep and to be ready in the morning, and you fulfill both of those responsibilities completely, your body having resolved the question hours before the night reaches its midpoint. The steppe beyond the camp is enormous and dark and quiet in the specific way of very large open spaces, which is not the absence of sound but the condition in which sounds are so separated from each other that each one exists alone, without the backdrop of ambient noise that places with more density provide. Wind across the frozen grass, the sound of a horse exhaling in the dark, a long breath that makes a small visible cloud in the cold air and then is gone. The distant sound of something moving at the edge of hearing, too far away to identify, too brief to pursue. Stars, enormous and uncountable in the clear and dry air at this altitude, arranged in patterns that the people of this steppe have been reading for navigation and for the marking of seasons for generations beyond counting. You have slept under these stars enough times that they are part of the furniture of your life, as familiar and unremarkable as anything can be that is also genuinely vast. The coals in the fire glow their particular dark orange at the centre of everything, the colour of a thing that has not finished, that will still be needed when the morning comes. Somewhere in the camp tonight there is someone who is dealing with an injury from the last engagement, or from the terrain, or from the accumulated toll of the march. The camp does not have the luxury of extended medical attention for most injuries. The bone setter and the practitioners of traditional medicine do what they can, and what they can do is considerable within the range of what traditional medicine offers, and what is beyond that range is handled through the body's own resources and the passage of time, or it is not handled. The injured soldier who cannot keep up ceases to be a soldier in any operationally meaningful sense. The system does not pause for them. This is not cruelty. It is the logic of a mobile operation in which slowing down is itself a risk, and resources are calculated to the margin. You have seen it enough times that it no longer registers as extraordinary. It is simply one of the conditions of this life. There will be other nights on this campaign that are not this night. Nights before an engagement, when the camp goes through the same motions but with a quality of awareness underneath them that the ordinary nights do not carry. The fire is the same fire. The food is the same food. The sounds of the camp settling are the same sounds. But the quality of consciousness sitting behind all of it is different. A particular alertness that is not fear exactly, though it is in the same neighbourhood, a heightened attention to all of the things that cannot be controlled, to the gap between the plan and what will actually happen, to the specific uncertainty that lives in any action, whose outcome depends on the behaviour of other people who are trying to produce an outcome contrary to yours. You do not pretend to yourself that you know how tomorrow will go. You know what you will do. You do not know what everything else will do. That distinction becomes very clear in the hours before an engagement, and there is nothing to be done about it except to ensure that your equipment is ready, and your horse is ready, and your body has had whatever rest the night allows. The experienced soldiers in your Arban do not talk about these things directly. The culture of this army does not organise itself around the expression of anxiety, not because the anxiety is absent, but because expressing it serves no useful purpose in a context where what is required is action rather than processing. You observe the fire, you observe the other men. Everyone is doing approximately the same thing, attending to the ordinary details of the night with slightly more care than the ordinary night requires, as if thoroughness in the small things can be a form of preparation for the large thing that is coming. It cannot, entirely. But it is the thing available, so it is the thing that is done. And then you sleep, or you lie in something near enough to sleep, and the night passes and the morning comes as it always does, and the day begins again. Which is not the absence of sound, but the condition in which sounds are so separated from each other that each one exists alone, without the backdrop of ambient noise that places with more density provide. Wind across the frozen grass, the sound of a horse exhaling in the dark, the distant sound of something moving at the edge of hearing, too far to identify, too brief to pursue, stars, enormous and uncountable in the clear dry air, arranged in patterns that the people of the steppe have been reading for navigation, and for the marking of seasons for generations beyond counting. The coals in the fire glow their particular dark orange at the centre of everything, the colour of a thing that has not finished yet, that will still be needed when the morning comes. And in the morning it will begin again, exactly as it did today, because that is the nature of the machine and the nature of the life you lead inside it. There is a kind of story that history returns to with great frequency, about men who rise to power from positions of relative comfort and privilege, who build on foundations that were prepared for them, who inherit the tools of authority and apply them with more or less intelligence to the production of legacy. That is not this story. The story of Temujin, the man who would be called Genghis Khan, begins not in comfort, but in the cold, specific reality of catastrophe, and everything he became afterward was constructed deliberately and directly on the particular lessons that catastrophe teaches to the people who survive it without looking away from what happened. He was born, most historians believe, around 1162 on the Mongolian steppe, into a world in which social position was the primary variable determining survival, and in which that position could change faster than it could be secured. His father, Yesugei, was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a man of some local standing, enough to matter, which was precisely enough to make what came next both devastating and, with the benefit of distance, somewhat predictable. When Temujin was approximately 9 years old, Yesugei was poisoned by members of the Tatar tribe, historic enemies of the Borjigin, while returning home from the visit he had just made to deliver his son to the family of his future wife. It was an ordinary journey, the kind of minor diplomatic movement that a man in his position made regularly, and he was dead before he arrived home. What followed the death of the chieftain was an education in how quickly social position dissolves when the only thing maintaining it stops breathing. The Borjigin clan that Yesugei had led looked at his widow, a woman named Hoylan, and her young children, and made the calculation that the resources required to support a widow without a powerful male protector were resources that could not be justified. They withdrew. The family was abandoned on the steppe with what provisions could not reasonably be denied them and nothing more. In the language of 13th century Mongolian political reality, this was not a cruelty, it was a decision. The cruelty was simply what the decision produced when acted upon. To understand what this meant in practice, it is necessary to understand what the Mongolian steppe was in this period, not as a geographic abstraction, but as a physical environment with specific demands. It was a landscape of extremes, of scorching summer heat and winters that could kill an unprepared person in hours, of beautiful open distances that concealed their dangers in the specific way of environments that do not announce themselves as hostile, because hostility is simply their normal condition. Food did not come easily to people outside the structured support of a functioning tribal unit. Water sources were known and managed within tribal territories and were not freely available to outsiders. The animals that could be hunted required equipment and skill, and more importantly time and energy that a family in precarious survival conditions could not always afford to spend on uncertain outcomes. The steppe was not a place that forgave mistakes, and the margin for error available to a widow with young children and no formal protection was very small indeed. Holen understood this better than anyone. She had not been born into ease. She had been taken, in the way that young women of value were regularly taken on the steppe, from her first husband by Yesugei in a raid, and she had made what she could of the marriage she had not chosen, and she had become, by the time of Yesugei's death, the kind of woman whose competence and determination had been shaped by a life that had never been particularly gentle. The abandonment did not break her. It confirmed what she already understood about the world, which was that it did not organize itself around the comfort of individuals, and that individuals who wanted to survive it had to organize themselves around its actual conditions. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. She is a figure who deserves considerably more attention than the historical record gives her, because the record of her survival strategy, fragmentary as it is, suggests someone of extraordinary practical intelligence. She understood the seasonal patterns of the steppe and moved the family according to them. She knew which plants were edible and in which season, knowledge that most people of her social position would have considered beneath their attention, and that in her changed circumstances was the difference between feeding her children and not. She maintained enough of a social presence on the edges of the networks that had abandoned her that she was not entirely without occasional access to information and to the minimal interactions that prevented complete isolation, because complete isolation on the steppe was its own kind of death, slower and less visible, but equally certain. The family survived, not safely, not in conditions that any reasonable assessment would have called adequate. They survived through the application of every skill and every resource available to a woman of intelligence and extraordinary determination in an environment that was actively and indifferently hostile to their existence. Holen dug roots. She gathered berries and whatever the steppe provided to people with enough need to look very carefully for it. She moved the family constantly because a fixed position without resources or protection was an invitation to the various categories of problem that the steppe regularly produced. She maintained the coherence of the family group through years of genuine scarcity, keeping her children oriented toward continuation during years when continuation was not obviously the rational position. For Temujin, these years were an education of the specific kind that cannot be replicated in more comfortable circumstances, because comfortable circumstances do not involve the actual consequence of failure. He learned hunger that was not a figure of speech. He learned cold that was not a metaphor. He learned what it felt like to exist outside the social system that organized everyone else's life, to be in the category of people whose needs had no mechanism within the system for being addressed. He learned what it meant to be abandoned by the people who were supposed to be responsible for you, and to be left to manage the consequences of that abandonment with whatever you had available. These lessons were not abstract. They went directly into the bone, into the layer of understanding that does not change with circumstance, and they remained there for the rest of his life. He was captured at some point during this period, the exact timing uncertain across different sources, taken by a rival clan and held with a wooden collar device called a kangwei, a heavy yoke that prevented comfortable sleep and made sustained movement awkward and demeaning in the specific way that all restraints designed to display powerlessness are demeaning. He was held for a period, and then he escaped, with the assistance of a man named Sorkhokhtani, who risked something genuine and specific to help him. Temujin did not forget this. When the power to repay the debt arrived many years later, he paid it specifically and with the kind of recognition that made clear the debt had been held in mind through the intervening time. This detail matters because it reveals something about how Temujin organized his understanding of obligation. He was not casual about what he owed or what was owed to him. He kept accounts carefully. His early attempts to build a power base were the work of someone who had learned from personal experience the exact texture of failure, and who therefore approached potential failure with unusual seriousness. His first significant alliance was with Togrul, the Khan of the Kerit tribe and a former ally of his father, which gave him a patron relationship that provided cover and resources during the years when his own power was insufficient to stand independently. He worked to accumulate followers through the mechanism that the steppe culture understood, demonstrated success in raiding and protection, the accumulation of loyalty through the distribution of gained resources, the building of a reputation for both competence and reliability that could attract men who were looking for a leader worth following. The alliance with Togrul was productive for years, and the campaigns they conducted together against shared enemies produced both military success and the kind of shared experience that binds people more reliably than formal agreements. But Togrul was also a man who understood what Temujin was becoming, and what Temujin was becoming was a power that would eventually exceed his own. The relationship deteriorated through a series of episodes that each side later characterized differently, and eventually broke into open conflict in which Temujin's forces defeated the Kerit and Togrul died attempting to flee. This outcome, which looks straightforward from the distance of 8 centuries, was not inevitable during the period when it was happening. Temujin was not yet the invincible figure that retrospect makes him appear. He lost battles, he made errors, he survived situations that could plausibly have ended differently. What distinguished him was not the absence of setbacks, but the quality of his response to them, which was to assess, adapt, and continue without the kind of extended hesitation that more comfortable people might have been able to afford. The marriage structure he built was also a political instrument of the First Order, which is worth noting specifically because it is so easy to reduce to personal or cultural background, rather than to the deliberate strategic calculation it largely was. His primary wife, Borte, whose abduction and recovery had been one of the defining early events of his rise, remained his principal partner through decades of campaign, and the children she bore him were his primary heirs. But the broader structure of Mongol marriage allowed for additional wives, and the children of those marriages also carried standing, which created the competing claims that the succession structure of the empire would later have to manage. In the immediate term, marriages were also the mechanism through which alliances were cemented, with daughters and sisters offered and received in arrangements that created mutual obligations between households of strategic importance. Temujin managed these arrangements with the same attentiveness to consequence that he brought to military decisions, because in the steppe world they were, at the level of long-term political effect, the same category of decision. The conventional approach to power on the steppe was the approach he had watched fail catastrophically around him. The endless cycle of tribal alliance and betrayal, the shifting of loyalties along kinship lines, the fragmentation that meant that even powerful coalitions could be dissolved overnight by a single act of treachery from a relative who had decided that another alliance offered better terms. He had watched this cycle from its most exposed position, as a child on its outside, and he had reached conclusions about it that the people operating within it were not positioned to reach. He began to build differently. Where the steppe tradition assigned positions of authority based primarily on lineage and tribal affiliation, Temujin gave authority to men who had demonstrated loyalty and competence regardless of their origins. Jebe, who had become one of his most effective generals, had literally shot Temujin's horse out from under him in battle before being captured. When Temujin asked who had fired the shot that brought his horse down, Jebe identified himself, which in the normal course of things would have been a risky admission. Temujin noted the honesty, appointed Jebe to a position of command, and the appointment was not a gamble. It was a calculation about the kind of loyalty that is actually reliable under pressure. Blood loyalty, Temujin had concluded from extensive personal experience, could be redirected by other blood at the critical moment. Loyalty earned through shared hardship and rewarded through genuine recognition of merit was the kind that held when the pressure was highest. He built toward that kind of loyalty consistently. He was also constructing, through every alliance and every campaign and every decision, about how to treat people who submitted versus people who resisted, a collective identity that had not previously existed as a political fact. The Mongols before Temujin were a collection of clans and tribes with different histories, different patterns of conflict and alliance, different regional identities, and no overarching political framework within which those differences could be managed. What he created was such a framework, and more than that, a sense of collective identity that could absorb formally separate groups and give them a shared basis for operating together. The word Mongol had meant a specific clan. He made it mean something larger. The process through which he achieved this absorption is worth examining because it reveals something about how he thought about the problem of building loyalty among people who had every reason to be suspicious of any central authority. For some groups, the incorporation was voluntary in the sense that the alternative was clearly worse, and they chose the better option while it remained available. For others, it came only after military defeat. But even in those cases, Temujin's approach was often to incorporate the defeated rather than simply to destroy them, to make them Mongol in the functional sense of the word he was creating, to give them a place in the structure and a stake in its success. This was not universal. There were groups he destroyed rather than incorporated, and those destructions were complete. But the pattern of incorporation was consistent enough to be recognized as a policy rather than an impulse, and it explains how an organization that was small and vulnerable at the beginning of his rise became large enough to defeat every other power on the steppe. The discipline he imposed, the yasa, his code of law and organizational regulation, was another element of this construction. The steppe had never had a consistent legal framework that transcended tribal custom. Different clans had different traditions for handling disputes, different understandings of obligation and punishment, and the absence of any shared standard was one of the features that made sustained alliance difficult, and the resolution of conflicts between groups contentious. Temujin's code addressed this directly, establishing rules that applied to everyone within the organization regardless of origin. Rules about the treatment of animals, about the management of water sources, about the conduct of trade, about the obligations between different levels of the hierarchy. The yasa was not a sophisticated legal code by the standards of the civilizations the Mongols would subsequently conquer, but it was a consistent framework, applied with a consistency that the steppe had not previously experienced, and consistency, when it is reliable enough to be trusted, is itself a form of political achievement. He also understood, earlier than most of the rulers of his era, the relationship between trade and power. The Silk Road routes that crossed the steppe were sources of enormous wealth for the people who controlled access to them, and the fractured political landscape of the pre-Mongol steppe had made those routes uncertain and dangerous, which suppressed the trade that might have passed through them. Temujin worked to establish the security of the routes within his growing zone of control, which attracted the merchants and trade that the security enabled, which produced the revenue and the goods and the intelligence networks that trade relationships carry with them. The connection between military power and commercial power was not a new insight in the medieval world, but the scale and consistency with which Temujin pursued it on the steppe was unusual. By 1206, enough of the steppe had been brought under his framework that the Kurultai, the great assembly of senior leaders, was convened at the sources of the Onon River. There, on the steppe that had been the entire world of his childhood and his survival, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan. The exact translation of the title is debated among scholars, but its sense points toward something universal, toward authority that is not bounded by the tribal distinctions that had previously organized everything. The man who had been abandoned on the steppe at 9 years old was now, by the formal recognition of the most powerful figures in the Mongol world, their sovereign. By any measure, this is an extraordinary trajectory. The gathering itself was not simply a formal ceremony, appended to a political reality that had already been settled. It was the expression of a political reality that had been constructed through specific choices over the preceding decades, and the people assembled at the Onon River were people who had in most cases fought against him at some point, and who were choosing to accept his authority because the combination of compulsion and genuine appeal had made acceptance the rational option. The white standard of 9 tails raised to mark his proclamation was the Mongol symbol of highest authority, and raising it in this context meant something that no similar ceremony had meant before, because no one before this moment had unified the steppe in this way. Whether the people assembled fully understood what they were participating in, whether they understood that this moment would eventually produce consequences that extended far beyond the horizon of any plan they could have been making, is impossible to know. They were, in any case, making a specific decision in a specific moment, as people always are, with the information available to them at the time, because it was visible at the scale that history can see. The campaigns against the Jin dynasty in northern China, which the Mongol army conducted with a combination of direct military force and strategic manipulation that demonstrated the army's capacity for complex operations over extended time. The western campaigns that carried the Mongol forces through Central Asia and into Persia and the Caucasus and beyond, destroying cities that offered sustained resistance with a completeness intended as a message, and sparing cities that submitted in the way that demonstrated the terms of the alternative. The Battle of the Kalka River in 1223, where a Mongol force of perhaps 20,000 men destroyed a combined Rus and Cuman force, many times their number through a combination of tactical deception and superior coordination, and then, having demonstrated the possibility, returned east without attempting to hold the territory, which is itself a statement about strategic intent that most military cultures of the era were not making. The tactics employed in these campaigns were not improvised. They had been refined through the years of warfare on the steppe, and then systematically adapted to the different challenges that campaigns against settled civilizations presented. Against Jin China, which possessed fortified cities that could not be taken by cavalry alone, the Mongols incorporated Chinese engineers and their siege technology into the army, absorbing the technical knowledge of conquered peoples and deploying it against the next opponent. Against the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, the largest and most powerful state they had yet engaged, the army operated on multiple axes simultaneously, with different columns crossing enormous distances to converge on multiple targets at once, producing an effect of omnipresence that prevented any coordinated resistance from forming. The commanders who executed these plans were men Temujin had trained and trusted with the specific kind of authority that allowed them to make tactical decisions independently while executing strategic intentions correctly. The psychological dimension of the campaigns was as deliberate as the military one. The pattern of total destruction for resistance and meaningful mercy for submission was not simply the expression of a violent culture. It was a carefully maintained policy with a specific purpose: to make the calculation facing every city and every ruler as clear as possible before the army arrived. The messengers sent ahead offering terms were not courtesy. They were the mechanism by which the policy communicated itself. The destruction of cities that refused was the enforcement. The protection of cities that accepted was what made the policy credible. It worked because it was applied with a consistency that convinced the people receiving the message that it was real. It was possible because of the organizational system, which was not separate from the conquests, but was their enabling mechanism. The decimal structure of the army produced clear chains of command and accountability. The relay system, the YAM, allowed information and orders to move across the empire at speeds that made coordination over long distances operationally viable. The discipline of the soldiers, shaped by years of training and by the consequences of its absence, meant that complex plans could be executed across large distances without the degradation of intent that typically occurred when orders passed through many layers of human interpretation, and the self-sufficiency of the army, its capacity to live off the land through which it moved and to move faster than a supply-dependent force, meant that it could appear in places and at times that no rational assessment of logistics would have predicted. He was also, at every stage, thinking about what the empire would be after the campaign. This is unusual enough in the historical record of conquerors to deserve specific attention. The destruction of resistant cities was real, and on a scale that emptied regions. But the pattern of the campaigns also included the deliberate preservation of skilled personnel, the retention of administrators and craftspeople and merchants who could maintain the productive capacity of conquered territories, the establishment of trade protections that made the Silk Road viable as a system in ways it had not been under the fragmented political arrangements it replaced. He understood, from whatever combination of intelligence and instinct produced the understanding, that an empire composed entirely of ruins was not an empire. It was a disaster with administrative pretensions. His religious policy, which has been written about extensively by historians, and which has generated more admiration among Western commentators than most of his other characteristics, was in its origins probably more pragmatic than idealistic. The Mongol worldview was shamanist at its core, centered on the sky deity Tengri and the spiritual power that intermediaries between the human and the unseen worlds could wield. Genghis Khan himself seems to have held these beliefs with genuine conviction. He also received Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Taoist masters, and Nestorian Christian clergy at his court, and engaged with them with what sources describe as genuine intellectual curiosity, asking questions about their beliefs and their practices and their understandings of the nature of things. The policy that emerged from this engagement was one of broad religious tolerance, with practitioners of different traditions protected from interference and exempt from certain taxation categories. The practical effect was that the Mongol Empire became a space in which diverse religious communities operated with a degree of security that many could not find elsewhere in their era. He died in 1227, on campaign in the northwest China region, engaged in operations against the Tangut state of Xixia, probably in his mid to late 60s by the most commonly accepted estimates. Though the historical sources are not entirely consistent, the cause of his death is genuinely uncertain. Different sources offer different accounts, none of them authoritative. He had been campaigning until close to the end, which is consistent with every other thing the record tells us about a man who did not seem to understand inactivity as a state compatible with his sense of his own purpose. His concern about succession had been extensive and detailed. He had divided the territories among his sons and specified the primary successor, with unusual directness for a political culture in which such specificity was rare. The arrangements did not fully achieve what they intended, because arrangements made by a single extraordinary person to govern the behaviour of ambitious successors rarely fully achieve what they intend. But what his sons inherited was still, at the moment of his death, the largest empire on earth, and it continued to expand under their management for decades afterward. The full arc of the empire he created, from its establishment on the steppe to the fragmentation of its successor states into the distinct polities that eventually replaced it, spans roughly 150 years, during which it was the dominant political and military fact in the Eurasian world. The trade that moved across the empire during the Pax Mongolica represents one of the more vivid demonstrations of what political stability, even enforced stability, does to commerce. Before the Mongol consolidation, the routes connecting China to the Mediterranean passed through multiple competing political entities, each of which represented a transaction cost, a risk, a toll, a possible confiscation. Merchants who wanted to move goods from east to west had to navigate a landscape of shifting allegiances and uncertain protections that made long-distance trade expensive and dangerous. Under Mongol administration, a merchant with the right credentials could travel the full length of the empire with a degree of security and consistency that the preceding political landscape had not provided. This did not make the journey comfortable or safe in any absolute sense, but it made it viable in a way that dramatically increased the volume of goods and the variety of things that moved. The silk and the spices and the ceramics that Europeans associated with the distant East became more available, more varied, and in some cases less expensive. The technologies that moved westward, papermaking and printing and gunpowder and the compass, arrived in the Islamic world and eventually in Europe along these routes, carried by merchants and scholars and diplomatic missions that the Mongol peace had made possible. The world that existed in 1350 was connected differently than the world that existed in 1200, and the difference was not incidental to the Mongol Empire. It was one of the empire's products, unintended but real. Cities emptied, agricultural systems destroyed, populations reduced to fractions of themselves in regions that took generations to begin recovering. The gap between the organizational achievement of the Mongol Empire and the human cost of its creation is one of the largest such gaps in the historical record, and it does not close through the appreciation of the achievement. Both things are present simultaneously, and the position that history requires us to hold is one of genuine complexity, not the comfort of simple condemnation or simple admiration, but the discomfort of holding both realities in view at the same time, which is the position that any honest engagement with this history eventually produces. Now consider that the empire this man built depended, at the level of daily military function, on the capacity of its individual soldiers to perform a skill that sounds simple, and is in practice among the most demanding physical achievements that human beings have systematically developed across any culture in any era. It depended on riding, and on shooting a powerful composite bear with accuracy and speed, and on doing both things simultaneously at full gallop over rough terrain under pressure. You're one of those soldiers, and this is what that requirement actually demands of a human body over the course of a life. You have been on a horse since before the first memory that is clearly yours. This is literally true. The children of the Mongolian steppe were placed on horses in their first years of life, before they could walk reliably on their own feet. First secured in place so they could experience the motion, then held, then supervised at increasing distances, then simply let go. Because in this culture, riding is not a skill that is taught at a suitable age through formal instruction. It is absorbed through continuous daily contact with horses from the beginning of awareness, until the boundary between the rider's sense of their own body and the horse's movement through space becomes genuinely difficult to locate. By the time you are old enough to be considered for military training in any serious sense, the riding is not a challenge. It is the medium in which every other challenge takes place. To ask a Mongol cavalry soldier whether he can ride is approximately equivalent to asking someone who has lived their whole life on water whether they know how to swim. The question barely translates into the language of their experience. The bow is where the challenge lives, not the bow as an object in the hands, not the basic mechanics of drawing a string and releasing an arrow. Those things can be learned in a season by anyone with adequate physical strength. What takes years, what takes the kind of continuous, daily, lifelong practice that begins before memory and never fully stops, is the capacity to perform that action correctly, with the appropriate power and with adequate accuracy, from the back of an animal moving at full gallop across terrain that is never entirely uniform, while the body manages the horse and the terrain and the wind and the distance and every other variable that the situation presents simultaneously. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. This is what the training is for, and the training is not organised around your timeline or your pace of progress or your comfort. It is organised around the requirement, which is fixed and does not adjust to accommodate the person being trained to meet it. Your bow is a composite recurve of the type refined by Mongolian bowyers across generations of systematic improvement toward the specific demands of this exact application. It is made in layers, with a core of wood providing the bow's basic structure, horn laminated to the belly, which is the side facing you when the bow is drawn, and sinew laminated to the back, the side facing away from you. The horn resists compression, and the sinew resists extension, and these two properties working in opposition allow the bow to store more energy per unit of draw length than any bow made from a single material could achieve. The limbs curve away from the archer when the bow is unstrung, the recurve shape that gives this style of bow its name, and this geometry produces a lower initial resistance at the beginning of the draw before building to full power, which reduces the fatigue accumulated across a session of sustained shooting in ways that matter considerably when the session is measured in hours rather than minutes. The bow is shorter than most traditions produce, short enough to be drawn and managed from horseback without the lower limb striking the horse's neck, but this compactness does not mean reduced capability. In the hands of a trained archer at full draw, it launches arrows at velocities that are effective at distances that would surprise people who form their intuitions about bow performance from other traditions built around different requirements. The construction of a quality composite bow is itself an achievement that takes skilled bowyers months, and sometimes more than a year from the selection of materials to the completion of a bow ready for use. The horn must be from specific animals, selected for specific qualities of density and grain. The sinew must be prepared through a specific process of cleaning and drying and preparation that affects its performance under stress. The wood core must be seasoned correctly and shaped precisely, because the geometry of the limbs is not uniform but varies in ways that govern how the stored energy distributes along the draw. The gluing and lamination happen in stages, with drying time required between each, and the final form is achieved through a process of heating and shaping that requires both skill and patience. The result of all this time and skill is the object you carry. You did not make it. Someone whose entire professional skill is devoted to making it made it. But you maintain it, and you understand it in the specific ways that a person who uses a tool daily comes to understand it, its preferences and its sensitivities, and the conditions under which it performs best and the conditions under which it requires care. The winter campaign raises specific challenges that the design of the bow addresses only partially. Cold makes the glues more brittle and the horn and sinew less flexible, which changes the bow's behaviour in the draw, and can, if the cold is severe enough and the bow has not been warmed gradually, produce failures that would not occur at normal temperature. You know this, and you manage it, keeping the bow inside the gear at night rather than leaving it exposed to the cold, warming it gradually in the morning before use, monitoring its behaviour in the first draws of the day for any sign that the cold has affected it. In very cold conditions, some archers use extra bowstrings soaked in grease to reduce the effect of the cold on the string's fibres. You have done this. It works well enough to be worth the additional preparation. You maintain this bow with the same quality of attention you give the horse, because the consequences of neglect are equally immediate and equally serious. The composite construction is sensitive to moisture in ways that a simple wood bow is not. The hide glues that hold the layers together respond to humidity and temperature in ways that must be anticipated and managed, and a bow that has been exposed to moisture or allowed to grow cold without gradual warming. Before use is a bow that may fail under load at the moment when its failure is most costly. You monitor the bowstring with ongoing attention, because the string is the final link between the bow and the arrow, and a frayed or weakened string is a string that will fail. And string failure in the middle of an engagement is a crisis with no good immediate resolution. You carry replacement strings as a matter of standard equipment, and you know how to replace them quickly enough that quickly is the only acceptable descriptor for the operation. Your training mornings, after the horses and the breakfast and the orders, involve the patterns of practice that you've been repeating since you were old enough to be given a bow of appropriate weight for your development at the time. The progression of bows you carried as you grew is its own kind of autobiography. The first one was light enough for a child's arms to manage, designed to instill the motion rather than to develop power, training the body to the geometry of the draw before the geometry mattered for any practical purpose. The weight increased as you grew, calibrated to what your developing muscles could handle consistently, because consistency was always the objective, not maximum effort applied irregularly, but the repeatable application of correct force that produces the same result each time regardless of how tired the body is. By the time you were considered ready for the field, your draw weight was in the range that the military required, and you could sustain it through a session that lasted as long as the session needed to last. The earliest memory you have that is clearly about the bow is the weight of it. Not the draw, not the release, not the arrow in flight, but the simple, unexpected weight of the bow itself in your young hand, the way it occupied space and had a balance point that was not where you expected it to be on that first day. Someone placed it in your hands and adjusted your grip and showed you where the balance lived, and the moment when you understood the balance was a moment that has persisted in memory long after most of the other details of that period have dissolved. The bow knows where it wants to rest, the hand learns to allow it. Everything that came after that moment, the years of practice, the development of power in the draw, the learning of the Parthian shot and the rapid sequence and the reading of wind and distance, all of it was built on that first moment of the hand finding where the bow wanted to be. You carry this bow now with the easy familiarity of something that has been yours long enough that you no longer notice its weight, unless you are attending to it specifically. It is part of your body when you are holding it, an extension of the arm rather than a separate object. This is what years of this produces, not mastery in the sense that people who have never done it imagine mastery to be, some elevated state of perfect execution, but mastery in the more accurate sense of deep familiarity, the state in which the boundary between the person and the tool has been worn smooth by contact until it is no longer entirely clear where one ends and the other begins. The Mongol army has encountered, in its expansion beyond the steppe, the walls of cities. Cities are a different kind of problem, and the problems they present require different solutions that the cavalry alone cannot provide. The siege equipment that travels with the army on major campaigns, catapults and mangonels and the engineering specialists who operate them, represents the adaptation of an originally steppe culture to the challenge of a settled world. As an archer, your role in a siege operation is different from your role in open country. You're covering the approaches, suppressing defenders on the walls, maintaining the kind of sustained harassment that keeps the defenders' heads down during the critical periods when the engineering approaches the walls. The work is methodical in a way that open country engagement is not. The geometry of the problem is fixed. The range is known. The targets are at defined positions on a defined structure. The challenge is endurance over time rather than the management of constant movement and uncertainty. Siege operations are also the category of work that is most dangerous for the archer, not because the defenders are necessarily more capable, but because the archer's vulnerability in a siege is higher than in mobile cavalry. You cannot ride out of range when the defenders have their own archers. You are fixed at a position that the defenders know about and can direct fire toward. The skills that protect you in open country, speed and mobility, and the unpredictability of your position are not available here. What is available is cover. The management of your position relative to whatever physical features the ground and the siege works provide, and the judgment about when to expose yourself, and for how long, which requires the same kind of calibrated attention that every other aspect of this work requires, but in a context where the error tolerance is lower. You are very aware in siege operations of the specific fact that the arrows coming toward you are equivalent to the arrows leaving your bow, They are the same object, travelling in different directions. The Parthian shot, turning backward in the saddle, while the horse continues forward at full speed and drawing and releasing at targets behind the direction of travel, is one of the signature techniques of this cavalry style, and it is also one of the techniques that requires the spine and hips and shoulders to achieve positions that the body finds counterintuitive until repetition makes them ordinary. The key mechanical problem is this: you're sitting on a horse that is moving forward, and you need to rotate enough of your body to shoot accurately behind you, while maintaining enough contact and control with the horse to not disrupt its gait or lose your seat. The solution is in the hips, which must remain oriented roughly with the horse while the torso rotates above them, and in the legs, which must maintain their grip and their role in communicating with the horse, even while the upper body is doing something entirely different. You have done it enough times that the transition from the forward-facing riding position to the turned backward shooting position happens without a significant interruption of the horse's gait. You have done it enough times that the positions feel ordinary. You continue doing it because ordinary and excellent are not the same category, and the training is about the latter. The rapid-fire sequence, the technique of maintaining a continuous flow of arrows, requires a physical memory of knocking and drawing and releasing that runs faster than conscious direction can manage, and that must therefore be in the body rather than in the mind, a rhythm as automatic as breathing, reliable under the conditions that engagement produces, when the ground is moving and the information is incomplete, and the body's running on whatever it has left. The knocking motion alone, finding the arrow in the quiver with the right fingers in the right orientation without looking, placing the notch of the arrow on the string at the correct angle in one smooth movement, is a skill that takes months to make automatic and years to make fast. You practice it separately from the draw and the release, isolating the component until the component is reliable, and then you practice it as part of the complete motion, and then you practice the complete motion at speed, and then you practice the complete motion at speed while the horse is moving, and eventually you can perform the entire sequence in the time that most archers are completing a single shot. This has a tactical consequence that shapes the entire philosophy of the Mongol cavalry engagement. When a unit of Mongol cavalry approaches, each rider capable of this sustained output, the volume of arrows in the air at any given moment is not comparable to anything that opposing infantry or cavalry can easily prepare for. It is not one arrow to be tracked and avoided. It is a pattern of arrows from multiple directions, arriving in close sequence that no individual response can adequately address. The shields can be raised, but the angle changes. The formation can be tightened, but that creates different vulnerabilities. The only effective counter is to either break the cavalry before the arrows exhaust you, or to prevent the cavalry from achieving the range at which it is most effective, and both of those options require capabilities that very few opponents of the Mongol army possessed at the time they encountered it. You carry, in addition to the bow and the quiver, a short recurve bow for close-range use when the primary bow would be inappropriate, a curved sabre for the close engagement that sometimes follows when the arrow exchange has produced a situation that requires direct contact to resolve, a lance for the initial charge when the situation calls for concentrated impact rather than sustained shooting, and a lasso, because the horse culture of the steppe produces applications for roping that purely infantry-based armies would never develop. The total weight of this equipment is managed across your body, and the horse's back in arrangements refined through experience to allow the most critical items to be accessed fastest. Nothing is placed arbitrarily. Everything is where it is because at the moment it is needed, the time available to find it is measured in fractions of a second. There is another dimension to this life that is more difficult to describe than the physical skills and the equipment and the daily maintenance. It is the dimension that long campaigns produce in the people who experience them, the particular relationship with time and with the idea of ordinary life that develops when you have been on the road for months or years, and the circumstances of the campaign are the only circumstances you have. The steppe is not foreign to you, it is the world you grew up in. But the campaign takes you far beyond the familiar portion of it, into territories and climates that are different from the ones your experience was built in, and the accumulation of that distance, both physical and temporal, produces something in the mind that is not quite homesickness but is adjacent to it, a kind of narrowing of the time horizon, a reduction in the range of things that seem worth planning for or anticipating. The future contracts to the next few days, then to tomorrow, then to the next halt, because planning further than that requires a confidence, about what further will contain that the campaign does not provide. The experienced soldiers manage this without discussing it, because the culture of this army does not organise itself around the expression of internal states, at least not in words. What you observe in the men who have been on many campaigns is a particular quality of presence in the immediate moment, an ability to attend fully to what is directly in front of them, without the distraction of what might be weeks ahead, which is a useful quality in an engagement and a sustainable quality in a march and a condition that looks, from outside, like equanimity. Whether it is equanimity or simply the exhaustion of the capacity for forward anxiety is a distinction that the circumstances do not make easy to determine. It may not matter. What the body accumulates across years of this life is its own kind of record. The calluses on the hands that form at the specific pressure points of the draw, hard and permanent enough that they outlast campaigns and become a physical record of how many of them there have been. The particular development of the muscles of the draw arm and shoulder, relative to the other side, and a symmetry visible enough that a person who knows what to look for can identify the archery-trained body from a distance. The compressed quality of the lower spine from years in the saddle. The specific wear patterns on the knee joints from years of managing a horse's movements through leg pressure. These are the signatures of this life written into the body, not chosen but accumulated, the physical text of what years of this work produces in the material of a person. There is one thing that the years also produce that is more difficult to describe than the physical changes, and it is this: a particular relationship to fear, not the absence of it. Fear in the face of genuine threat is a functional response, and the experienced soldier does not pretend otherwise. But the relationship to it changes. What was, in the early years, a sharp and disruptive intrusion that occupied attention and impaired performance, becomes, over time, something more familiar, something that arrives and is noted and is not allowed to take over the available attention. You have been afraid before. You have been afraid and continued to function. The fear did not kill you. The body learned this, the way the body learns everything, through repetition. And what it learned was that fear was manageable, that the state of being afraid and the state of being capable were not mutually exclusive, and that the management of the first was one of the things that the training had been preparing you for all along. The horses, multiple per soldier on campaign, rotated through the day's movement so that no single animal reaches exhaustion before the day is over. Each horse is individual, with individual characteristics that a rider who knows them well can use strategically. This one has more speed but less sustained endurance. That one is more reliable on rough terrain at the cost of somewhat reduced pace on flat ground. The third handles the specific cold of pre-dawn hours better than the others, and is preferable for the early morning movement when the ground is at its most frozen and uncertain. Knowing the difference and deploying it correctly is part of the job, because the optimization of the human-horse relationship across a long day of movement adds up, over the course of a campaign, to the difference between an army that arrives at its objective with its horses functional and an army that arrives with its horses compromised. The nights after engagements are different from other nights. There is an exhaustion specific to days of actual fighting that has a quality different from the exhaustion of march days, not simply physical, though it is that, but something in the system beyond the muscles, something that takes longer to settle, and that the fire does not fully address. The men around you at the fire are the same men, but the fire on these nights sits differently in the perception of people who have just been through something that required more of them than the ordinary day requires. You eat. You check your equipment with the thoroughness that follows any day that genuinely tested it. You count the arrows remaining. You examine the bow for any change that the day introduced. You check the blade, and then you sleep when the body finally makes the decision, completely and without reservation, and the night does its work on the things that the conscious mind cannot address directly. The engagements, when they occur, have a quality that is very different from the theory of them, and also very different from the retrospective accounts, written by people who had time to organise what they observed. During an engagement, you are occupying a very small piece of a very large situation. You can see what is immediately around you, the terrain within close range, the riders of your unit, the part of the enemy formation you are directly engaging. You cannot see the larger shape of the battle, the movements of the other units, the way the overall situation is developing. You execute your part of the plan and trust that the other parts of the plan are being executed. because that is the only thing available to you, and trusting a plan that has been made by people who have done this many times and who are receiving better information than you have is a reasonable position to hold. What the training is for, ultimately, is not the skill in isolation. It is the skill under the specific conditions of the worst moments, when the ground is moving and the information is incomplete, and the body is already depleted and the situation has diverged from what was planned. The technique that holds under those conditions is the one that has been practiced until it no longer requires a decision. Everything that requires active decision-making is vulnerable to the disruption that those conditions produce. Everything that is in the body simply continues. By the time the empire had expanded to the scale that Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons achieved, and then struggled to sustain, it had developed an interior world almost entirely invisible to the civilizations it had conquered. From the outside, the Mongol state appeared to be a military apparatus, a structure of command and organized violence that had imposed itself on the world through force and maintained itself through the continued threat of that force. That reading was not wrong, but it was significantly incomplete. The court within the empire, the political and social world where decisions were actually made, and relationships were actually managed and successions were actually contested, was a considerably more complex and in many respects more interesting place than the image the outside world formed of it. The first surprise for anyone approaching the Mongol court expecting a straightforward military hierarchy is the presence and the authority of women. Not their presence in a ceremonial or domestic sense, but their presence as genuine political actors with real authority over real territory and real outcomes. This surprises observers who form their expectations from the political cultures of medieval Europe or medieval Islam, both of which treated female political authority as either an emergency measure or an aberration. In Mongol culture, women had occupied positions of genuine administrative authority for generations before Genghis Khan, and his empire did not diminish that tradition. It operated within it as a structural feature. Holon, Genghis Khan's mother, is the earliest prominent example and in some ways the most instructive. She kept her children alive through the abandonment on the steppe, through her own intelligence and determination and management of minimal resources. She remained a figure of genuine influence through her son's rise, not a figurehead but a woman whose judgment was taken seriously by the man who had reorganized the world. She was not a symbolic presence. She was a person who exercised real judgment in conditions that were genuinely difficult, and whose competence in doing so was visible to the people around her. Sorkhokhtani Beki is the later example that historians find most significant, in part because the scope of her influence and the consistency of her success make her impossible to explain without taking seriously. She was the widow of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son, and through her 4 surviving sons she effectively shaped the succession of the empire for the generation after the first succession crisis. Her eldest son Mongke became Great Khan. Her second son Kublai became the ruler of China, and one of the most famous figures in the entire Mongol narrative. Her third son Hulagu founded the Ilkhanate in Persia. Her fourth son Arik Boki contested the succession against Kublai with enough force to require several years of military resolution before Kublai prevailed. That all 4 sons of a single woman achieved the highest levels of power in the empire is not coincidence. It is the result of decades of careful political management by a woman who understood the system she was operating within, and who worked it with consistent intelligence and patience. The specific mechanisms of that management are worth examining because they illuminate how power actually functioned in this court behind the public image. Sorkhokhtani understood that the empire's future would be shaped by which branch of the ruling family retained the confidence of the most significant stakeholders, and she spent the years of her widowhood ensuring that her branch accumulated that confidence methodically. She governed her territories visibly and well, which gave her a reputation for administrative competence that made her sons' claims to authority easier to defend. She maintained relationships with religious figures of multiple traditions, which meant that whichever religious direction the empire's different branches moved in, she had already established goodwill in that direction. She arranged her sons' educations to include exposure to the languages and cultures of the peoples they might eventually govern, which was not a standard practice and was explicitly a preparation for rule rather than simply for military command. Every decision was oriented toward a long-term outcome that she did not live to see fully realized, but that her choices made possible. She was offered in marriage to Ogadai, her brother-in-law when Tolui died, which was the conventional arrangement that would have kept her within the orbit of the immediate ruling structure. She declined, which was itself a political act, preserving her independence of action and her ability to manage her own household and her son's development without the competing obligations that such a marriage would have created. That she could make this refusal and have it accepted reflects the degree to which her standing in the court was genuine rather than merely formal. She was not a woman whose preferences could be overridden without cost. Sorkhokhtani was a Nestorian Christian who cultivated productive relationships with Buddhist, Muslim and Taoist religious figures with equal facility, which reflects both her personal pragmatism and her political sophistication. She managed the territories under her administration with a skill that sources from multiple cultural traditions acknowledge, even those that had no particular motivation to credit a Mongol woman. She understood. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. She understood that the empire's diverse population required administration that did not antagonize the religious and cultural identities of the governed, and she practiced that understanding systematically. The traveller Ibn Battuta, who moved through parts of the Mongol world in the 14th century and had extensive experience of the range of political cultures in his era, noted with observable surprise the degree to which women participated in public and political life in the Mongol world, because it was genuinely different from what he had seen elsewhere. The senior wives of Khans, the Khatuns, held positions with real administrative and representational functions. They managed households that in the Mongol context were also economic and political units of significant scale, responsible for the management of territories and the provision of hospitality to the constant flow of visitors, ambassadors, and petitioners that a major court attracted. They participated visibly in the ceremonial life of the court in ways that made their status unmistakable. The image of the Mongol world as a place where women were invisible or marginal is simply incorrect as a characterization of the court and the senior levels of the empire's political life. The Kurultai, the great assembly that made the major decisions of the empire, was in theory a mechanism for collective decision-making, a gathering of the senior stakeholders in the imperial enterprise to deliberate on questions of succession, military strategy, and policy. In practice, it was a contested political space in which different branches of the ruling family, different regional power centres, and different administrative factions pursued their interests through the forms of collective deliberation. The decisions it produced were real decisions with real effects on the empire's trajectory, but they were produced through a process that involved negotiation, alliance building, information management, and the application of various forms of pressure, which is the ordinary process of politics conducted at an elevated scale. The succession crises that followed Genghis Khan's death were not simply the product of individual ambition, though they were also that. They were the structural consequence of a system that had been held together by the personal authority of a single extraordinary figure, an authority that was in its nature personal rather than institutional, and that could not be transferred through any formal mechanism. The divisions Genghis Khan had made among his sons were intended to balance power while preserving unity. They produced instead a set of regional powers with increasingly divergent interests that the Kurultai could manage during periods of relative goodwill, and could not contain when goodwill was absent. The first major succession contest, which followed the death of Ogadai in 1241, established a pattern that would repeat throughout the following decades. A regent governed during the period required to convene the Kurultai, which could take months or longer given the distances involved and the complexity of assembling the necessary participants. Different factions within the court supported different candidates, whose interests aligned with their own, and the period of the regency was itself a period of intense political activity in which the information environment was actively shaped by people with strong preferences about the outcome. Alliances were built and tested. Grievances from previous succession contests were brought into play. The eventual resolution emerged from the combination of genuine consensus, applied pressure, and the particular exhaustion that prolonged political stalemate eventually produces when no other resolution is available. The physical character of the court added a dimension to these dynamics that fixed capital courts did not have to manage. The Mongol court moved with the seasons, following the nomadic calendar that the culture had not abandoned even as it administered settled civilizations of enormous complexity. The great ger encampments that housed the court migrated between summer and winter pastures, on a schedule that was itself a political fact, because access to the Khan at a given moment depended on being in the right place at the right time, and being in the right place at the right time required both information and resources. The geography of influence was a moving geography, and the map of it had to be continuously redrawn. The poison in the court's history is documented with a matter-of-factness in some sources that is itself instructive about the environment. Poison as a political tool has specific advantages in any court system: difficulty of proof, compatibility with natural illness as an explanation, the removal of a rival without the complications of open conflict, and the counter-alliances that open conflict activates, the ability to maintain subsequent relationships that a public move against the target would have destroyed. The Mongol court was not uniquely poisonous by the standards of medieval courts, but the combination of enormous stakes, close family proximity in the succession structure, and contested legitimacy created conditions that made the tool attractive with sufficient regularity that its use was a standard assumption in any unexplained significant death. The practice of tasting food before it reached a senior figure was standard procedure, understood as a precaution against this specific risk. The use of gold and silver vessels at table reflected the belief, medically incorrect but widely held, that these materials would react visibly to the presence of poisons, providing an early warning. The attention paid to the health of politically significant figures had a character that mixed genuine personal concern with the political calculation inseparable from the reality that any significant death produced an immediate redistribution of power affecting everyone in the vicinity, and that the people in the vicinity understood this clearly and acted accordingly. The religious life of the court grew more complex as the empire expanded, and as different branches of the ruling family developed different relationships with the religious traditions of the peoples they governed. The Ilkhanate in Persia moved toward Islam over several reigns through a process that included genuine personal conversion in some cases and political calculation in others, transforming the character of that branch of the empire in ways that its founders would not have recognized. The Yuan dynasty in China developed an elaborate relationship with Tibetan Buddhism in particular, with the Pagpa Lama occupying a position at Kublai Khan's court that combined religious authority with political access in ways that were unprecedented in both traditions. The Golden Horde became predominantly Muslim over time, aligning with the Islamic world in ways that would shape the history of the Western steppe regions for centuries beyond the end of the Mongol political structures. These were not smooth processes. The religious advisors and clerics with access to the court were not passive figures. They were active participants in court politics, advocating for their traditions and for the communities those traditions served, working to influence decisions that would affect large populations. The Buddhist presence at the Yuan court was also a political presence with interests and with the capacity to advance them. The same was true of Muslim scholars, of Nestorian Christian bishops, of Taoist representatives from China. The Mongol court was the meeting point of all of these traditions in a political framework that had not formally committed to any of them, and the competition between them for influence shaped the court's internal culture in ways that made it unlike any other political environment in the medieval world. This competition was not always polite. There are accounts of formal debates organised at the Mongol court between representatives of different religious traditions, the Khan and his court serving as the audience while Buddhist and Taoist scholars argued their respective positions, or Christian and Muslim theologians defended their claims. These debates were partly entertainment and partly genuine inquiry on the part of rulers who were trying to navigate a world full of incompatible metaphysical claims. They were also political events in which the outcome, or the impression of the outcome, could affect the standing of different religious communities within the empire's governance structure. A religious tradition that showed well in such a debate could expect increased access and possibly increased protection. One that showed poorly could expect the reverse. The scholars who participated understood this perfectly and prepared accordingly. The daily texture of religious life in the court was more complicated than these formal events suggest. A court that included members of multiple religious traditions also included the practical incompatibilities that multiple religious traditions produce in close proximity. Questions of diet, of scheduling, of which spaces and objects were appropriate for which purposes, of how different religious observances would be accommodated in a shared physical environment, had to be resolved repeatedly and at the level of daily life rather than at the level of formal policy. The people who managed these practical details The household administrators and the translators and the personal attendants of the senior figures were doing a kind of religious diplomacy continuously, in the small transactions of daily existence that the grand debates and the formal policies could not address. The administrative apparatus that actually maintained the empire's daily function was a remarkable improvisation by a culture with no prior experience of governing settled civilizations at this scale. The Mongols had conquered peoples with sophisticated bureaucratic traditions, and they had, with pragmatic intelligence, largely retained those traditions and the people who maintained them. Chinese administrators ran Chinese administrative systems under Mongol oversight. Persian bureaucrats managed Persian territorial affairs under similar arrangements. The script developed for the Mongol language, using a system derived from Uyghur writing by the scribe Tatatonga, captured from the Naiman tribe and put to work by Genghis Khan creating a written Mongolian language, became the medium through which a culture with no tradition of extensive written record-keeping began to generate the documentation that governance at this scale required. The result was a layered system that was not elegant in any architectural sense, but that worked across enormously diverse territories because it was built on existing functional components rather than replacing them with something new that had not been tested. What this produced in practice was a court full of people managing the continuous gap between different cultural frameworks. A Mongol commander governing a Persian city brought with him assumptions about authority and respect, and acceptable arrangements that did not match the assumptions of the Persian administrators and population he was governing. The Persian administrators brought their own framework, developed across centuries of dealing with different ruling powers, that was also not entirely compatible with the Mongol framework, and in between these two frameworks, moving between them daily, were the translators and cultural intermediaries who were indispensable to both and fully at home in neither. These figures occupy an unusual position in the history of the empire because they are almost entirely absent from the official record, which tends to record the decisions and the commanders and the outcomes rather than the people whose work made communication between all of those elements possible. But the empire could not have functioned without them, and the work they did was as essential to holding the enterprise together as any military operation. The court of Kublai Khan in his capital, which would become Beijing, was genuinely cosmopolitan in ways that would have bewildered a contemporary European court. Officials and merchants and religious figures and scholars and ambassadors from across the entire range of the known world were present simultaneously, conducting the business of the empire in a dozen languages and cultural frameworks, managing the persistent gap between their own traditions and the Mongol political culture that governed them. Marco Polo spent 17 years in the vicinity of this court, and returned to Venice with accounts that his contemporaries found difficult to credit, not because he was inventing things, but because nothing in the European experience of the period provided the context necessary to make his descriptions feel plausible. The scale, the variety, the administrative sophistication of what he described were real. They were simply outside the range of his audience's experience. What Marco Polo was observing and struggling to convey to an audience that had no frame of reference for it was not a foreign curiosity. It was the most complex administrative enterprise in the world at that moment, managing a territory that contained more people and more cultural diversity than any other political entity on Earth. The fact that it was being managed at all, let alone managed with the relative stability that the Pax Mongolica represented, was itself an achievement. The fact that it was being managed through an improvised system assembled from the components of a dozen conquered administrative traditions, held together by a ruling culture that had no precedent for this kind of governance, made it genuinely extraordinary. Marco Polo saw the surface of this, the scale of it, the wealth of it, the diversity of it, the machinery beneath the surface, the translators and the adapted bureaucracies, and the carefully calibrated religious tolerance, and the women-running portions of it. While the official record mentioned only the Khans, he saw only partially, as any outsider would. The great feasts that punctuated the court calendar were governance expressed through ceremony. The seating arrangement at a major banquet communicated information about every person present's current relationship to the Khan and to each other. The gifts distributed were not simply generosity. They were investments in loyalty and acknowledgements of service, public signals of favour and disfavour that everyone present was reading with the care of people whose material and political futures depended on accurate reading. The proximity to the Khan at table, the vessel from which you drank, the portion of the meal you received, the presence or absence of direct address and its tone, all of these things were information flowing through the ceremonial structure of the occasion with considerable efficiency for people trained to receive it. The specific mechanics of these feasts were developed with the same attention to strategic purpose that characterized every other aspect of the Mongol court's operation. The distribution of gifts, which happened at the major seasonal feast that corresponded to the Mongol calendar, was an opportunity for the Khan to communicate publicly which relationships he was investing in and which he was allowing to diminish, all through the mechanism of what appeared to be generosity. A person who received a fur robe of a certain quality was being told something about their standing. A person who received a horse of exceptional quality was being told something different. A person who received nothing, or whose gift arrived through an intermediary rather than directly, was being told something else entirely. The people assembled at these feasts were not simply attending a celebration. They were reading a document about the current state of the empire's internal politics, written in the language of distributed material goods, and they were reading it with full attention because what it said about them had direct practical consequences for the days and weeks ahead. The decay of the empire was a process rather than an event. The fragmentation into successor states was experienced from inside not as failure, but as the ordinary political process of regional powers developing regional identities. The Yuan dynasty in China was overthrown in 1368 by forces that had been building resistance through generations of accumulated grievance that eventually found the political leadership capable of converting resentment into organised action. The Ilkhanate dissolved in the first half of the 14th century through a fragmentation process that left no single successor with sufficient authority to maintain the structure. The Golden Horde persisted in attenuated form but was increasingly a regional power rather than a fragment of something universal. The Black Death deserves specific attention in this context, because it is the most consequential unintended consequence of the Mongol peace, and one of the most significant events in the entire history of the second millennium. The plague that devastated Europe between 1347 and 1353 moved along the trade routes that the Mongol system had opened and maintained, carried by the fleas on the rats in the cargo of the ships and the caravans that the Pax Mongolica had made viable. The death toll in Europe alone, estimated at between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population, reshaped the labour market, the power relationship between lords and peasants, the authority of the church, the development of vernacular languages and literatures, and the psychological and cultural character of European civilization in ways that historians are still working to fully account for. None of this was intended. The Mongol system had not been designed to spread plague, but a network designed to move goods and information moves everything that attaches itself to goods and information, and the plague was very good at attaching itself. What remained, in the regions that had been part of the Mongol world, was a legacy of extraordinary complexity. The devastation of the initial conquests was real and lasted in specific places for generations. The Pax Mongolica was also real and produced effects on trade and on the movement of ideas and on the connections between parts of the world that had been effectively separate. The plague moved along those connections and changed European history more dramatically than almost any other single factor of the medieval period. The cultural exchanges facilitated by the Mongol peace, the transmission of technologies and artistic influences and administrative practices across vast geographic ranges, left marks in the historical record that are still visible. The court behind the campaigns, the world of women holding genuine authority and poisons in gold cups, and religious advisors competing for influence, and translators navigating between civilizations in the same room, was the mechanism of all of it, the human interior of an empire that its exterior image could never adequately describe. The court disappeared. The Jia encampments disappeared. The great feasts and the careful seating arrangements and the tasted food in the gold vessels disappeared. What remained was the sediment, the trade routes that became permanent features of Eurasian commerce, the administrative traditions that outlasted the administrations that introduced them, the genetic legacy of the Mongol migrations visible in populations from China to Russia to the Middle East, and the memory, preserved in the records of the people who encountered the empire and survived to write about it, of something that had been genuinely unlike anything before or since. The hidden reality of the Mongol court was not the violence, though violence was present and consequential. It was the improvisation, The continuous, creative, sometimes desperate improvisation of people trying to govern something that no precedent had prepared them for, because nothing like it had existed before. And in that improvisation, in the court beneath the official court, in the politics behind the campaigns, in the women who held power that surprised everyone except themselves, in the translators who were the invisible joints of the entire enterprise, in the religious figures arguing for their traditions in structures that had been assembled over the ruins of civilizations they had helped destroy, in all of that there is something that every subsequent institution has eventually discovered for itself, that the gap between the official image and the human reality is always wider than it looks from outside, and that the human reality, with all its complications and its improvisation and its poison in gold cups, is always the more interesting story. Tonight we travelled through the felt walls and frozen mornings of the Mongol war camp, that extraordinary moving settlement organised as a military machine and functioning as a community, and managed with a precision that no army of its era could match, and very few in any era have matched since. We spent time with the man who built it, who started with nothing in a literal sense, who absorbed the lessons of his catastrophic childhood with a thoroughness that shaped everything he subsequently made, and who created at enormous cost something that changed the world permanently in ways that are still written into the geography and the political patterns and the cultural memory of multiple continents. We rode through the days of a Mongol archer, through the years of training before those days, and the specific physical demands of those days themselves, through the cold mornings and the march days and the engagements and the nights that followed them, carrying a bow that took months to make and required a lifetime of practice to use correctly. And we stepped behind the image of the empire into the court itself, the complicated and human world of women who held real authority, and of religions competing for influence, and of improvised administrative systems assembled from the parts of a dozen conquered civilizations, held together by political intelligence and the occasional cup of something that tasted wrong. What connects all of it is a thread that runs through every topic this channel visits, regardless of era or geography or scale, the gap between the image and the interior. The Mongol war camp looked from outside like the encampment of a barbaric horde, which is the description that the peoples it destroyed gave it and that history repeated for a long time afterward. It was actually a precision instrument maintained by people who had internalized its logic so completely that the discipline expressed itself not as constraint but as the ordinary texture of daily life, something no more remarkable to them than breathing, because it had always been this way, and they had no other reference point to compare it to. The Mongol court looked, to the civilizations it ruled, like the seat of alien and incomprehensible authority, the exercise of power so absolute it seemed beyond human negotiation. It was actually a place where people navigated hierarchy and managed succession, and worried about poison in their food and cultivated useful relationships and argued about religion, which is, when you remove the felt and the horses and the steppe, a set of activities that any medieval court would recognize immediately. The people who lived inside all of this, the soldier who checked his horse's legs every morning before the camp moved, the mother who kept her children alive through the years of abandonment on the steppe, through intelligence and determination that the historical record preserves only in fragments, the archer whose shoulders carried the accumulated weight of 1,000 repetitions of the same draw, the court translator who moved between civilizations in the same room and was fully at home in none of them. They were not abstractions. They were people with bodies in specific climates, making specific decisions, with specific amounts of food and water and warmth available to them, inside systems that had not been designed around their comfort or their preferences or their private sense of what their lives ought to contain. They endured, as people always have, not because they had arrived at a philosophy of endurance, but because endurance was what the situation required, and they were in the situation, and the situation did not have an exit that looked better than continuing. History keeps the record of the moments it can see, the battles and the successions and the conquests and the political collapses. What it records less carefully is the morning, the ordinary morning that preceded the recorded moment, the fire rebuilt from coals, the horse tended in the cold, the bowl of tea taken in the grey pre-dawn light before the day's demands assembled themselves around you, the living texture of existence inside the recorded structures, the texture made of cold and warmth and hunger and fullness, and the weight of a saddle across a long day, and the particular quality of sitting by a fire when the day's requirements have been met. This texture was the actual experience of the people whose history we read. It was what they inhabited, not the grand arc that posterity drew through their lives, but the specific hour, the specific morning, the specific bowl in the specific hand. Let the night settle around you now. Let the distance of all that history rest where it belongs, which is somewhere out beyond this moment, large and interesting, and no longer requiring your immediate attention. The cold of the steppe is not here. The weight of the bow is not here. The political pressures of the court are not here. What is here is the quiet and the dark and the comfortable drift toward the place between waking and sleeping, where the mind releases its hold on the day and lets the night do its work. The felt was real. The fire was real. The horses breathing in the dark beyond the Gur walls were real 8 centuries ago, on a steppe that is still there, still flat, still enormous, still indifferent to the passage of everything that has crossed it. And all of it has been resting in the past for all that time, patient and complete, waiting for someone to take the time to listen. Rest now. You have travelled a long way tonight, and the morning when it comes will be your own. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.